In this lecture, we'll cover the concept of competence. I'm going to go out of order a little bit for this lecture. Beecham and Childress start with the gatekeeping discussion, but I'm going to end with it. Instead, I want to focus on what the concept of competence is, look at the standards of competence that Beecham and Childress tell us about, and then talking about how we might test for competence or incompetence, and then end with the gatekeeping part. I want to start off by just looking at the concept of competence. What do we mean when we say somebody is either competent or incompetent? Your inclination might be to think that competence is connected with knowledge. I think that that is a strong intuition to have and one you should follow. But there's also another element to competence. There's being able to enact certain or things that you might will. So let me give you an example. Playing video games. You might have a knowledge of how the video game works, and then your competence plays itself out in how you play the video game. The only thing is, as we'll see here, how straightforward is competence? Is it as simple as knowing the rules of the game? Do people have different thresholds of competences? And here, Beecham and Childress are trying to get us to think a little bit more deeply about this. So how much does someone have to understand before they are considered competent? If we think about how my ability to play video games, I am not very good at them. I pretty much do them just to play with my brother so we can stay connected. He is a much better video game player than I am, but are we both competent at playing video games? Is he more competent at playing video games? Is there a point in which we say that I'm incompetent at playing video games if I'm not able to do as well as he does in the video games? So the question is, how do we start to understand when somebody moves from being incompetent to competent or from competent to incompetent? Next, we would probably want to know if a patient is incompetent or competent at one time, does that necessarily mean that they should always be treated as either competent or incompetent? This obviously lends itself to a pretty simple example. Imagine being under the influence of alcohol, or if you're taking a different medication. Does that impact your ability to be competent? I think most of us would agree that it can at least erode some of that competence and affect the way in which you're able to make autonomous decisions, because ultimately we're interested in competence so we can make autonomous decisions. That's another issue that we probably should keep in the back of our mind here, is that competence is usually something that's pretty fluid, and judging a person as competent at one time or incompetent doesn't mean that they're necessarily always have to be treated as that. So competence is sort of a threshold of understanding for an action to qualify as autonomous, as I was just saying. And that's the connection here with the principle of respect for autonomy. Now let's look at the standards of incompetence. I really like what Beecham and Childress do here in this chapter and with the issue of competence and incompetence, because if you remember about the question when it comes to opt-in or opt-out strategies of consent, there is this issue about, do we treat patients as competent and then we have to look for signs that they are actually incompetent, or do we treat all patients as incompetent and they have to prove that they are competent? And it seems like the burden would be too onerous if we did the latter, insofar as we always treat patients as incompetent and they have to prove it to us that they are indeed competent. And so Beecham and Childress suggest that we start with the presumption that patients are competent and then investigate to see if they show signs or inabilities that suggest that they are actually incompetent. Now, I won't read all of these different abilities that Beecham and Childress have collected from the literature. They group them up into three different groups. The first inability is connected with being able to formulate a preference. The second one is connected with the ability to understand information and appreciate one's situation. And the third one here is just about reasoning through consequential life decisions. And it seems like all of those are expectations that a patient should be able to fulfill if they are competent, and if they are having difficulty fulfilling or enacting those abilities, then it might be reason to consider the patient as incompetent or look for more ways to test their competence. I was just saying, the next step would be testing for incompetence. And I really like this section from Beecham and Childress, but it could definitely be expanded to add more detail. So as we were just discussing, there's this question about should patients be treated as competent and then they must demonstrate a lack of competence to be considered incompetent, or should it be switched around? And so the equivalent here is like with the legal system. Are the accused considered guilty and then they have to prove their innocence? Well, no, we put the burden of proof on the prosecution. Why is that? Because it seems like the burden should be placed on those who are making this accusation that are going to ultimately restrict a person's autonomy. So what's at stake? Person's ability to make decisions on their own. That seems to be a pretty high stake for what's going on here. And then how sure can we be of our evaluations? This is the part that I think Beecham and Childress could have expanded on a little bit more than what they did, because it is really impactful. Because we typically think about standardized tests in medicine and other disciplines, and we just don't reflect on how those tests might be biased in one way or another, and whether or not they might be incorrectly reporting somebody's competence. So Beecham and Childress note how there are these different ingredients that are tinged with normative or normativity, meaning that we ultimately make decisions about what counts as normal or competent and incompetent or deficient based on how we experience the world ourselves. So we choose relevant abilities for competence, ones that we might be familiar with. And then we choose a threshold level of those abilities, and then we design some sort of empirical test for that ability. And so imagine a situation in which thinking that only running counts as being athletic. And so you count that as the sort of ability to test competence on, and then you're going to choose a threshold for it, and then you design an empirical test. And there are a lot of ways to be athletic that doesn't necessarily require being able to run fast or for long distances. And so ultimately, we might consider people non-athletic who are actually athletic based on our own preconceived notions of what counts as athletic and what doesn't count as athletic. This happens in all facets of life. And so it's quite common. And the issue is that if we just treat these objective tests as sort of the standard to measure it, and that they count in all situations, there's a real sense in which we're not testing for the type of competence that we think would be necessary for people to have autonomy. We are testing people for competence based on our own standards. And so that's where this gets really tricky. And like I said, I wish Beecham and Childress said a little bit more about it, but be sure to think about this issue for testing for competence not being as straightforward as, hey, here's the one that everybody agrees counts, and not taking into consideration that it's a little bit more messy than that. I want to finish by talking about the concept of gatekeeping. If you're not familiar with it, it's the idea that a person in a position of power limits another person's access to something or limits their decisions in some way or another. So we've been talking about this idea of competence and incompetence. I've been trying to stress to you that you have to be very careful to restrict somebody's autonomy, because it ultimately restricts their ability to make decisions on their own behalf. And as a sort of considered moral judgment here, we think that people should be allowed to make decisions on their own for their own sake. And so gatekeeping raises this issue because you'll ultimately decide what opinions are worth considering and which ones should be ignored. And so this idea of gatekeeping is, imagine a patient approaches you and says, hey, I think I should get insulin because I read this thing online. And you ask them, well, are you a diabetic? And they say no. Your response would be, well, I don't think that I should give you insulin because it's going to cause a lot of harm. You might have a seizure. It might cause brain damage. So I'm not going to give you insulin. And if they still are adamant about getting it, you can just tell them, hey, the only way you're getting it is through me, and I'm not giving it to you, so we just should forget about it. That's a situation of gatekeeping. And are you justified in doing that? Well, the idea here is that you have a responsibility to your patient, and once we get to the principle of beneficence later in the chapter or later in the semester, you'll have more ability or more resources to negotiate this sort of gray area about gatekeeping and making decisions, even though patients might desire a certain type of treatment or something like that. And here, though, just think about gatekeeping and declaring patients as either competent or incompetent. That's a pretty big power to have over them, and so it should be not taken lightly, is what I really want to stress here. Ultimately, there's a gatekeeping role that you're undoubtedly going to have to play, but you should be thinking about this negotiation between the respect for autonomy and also your job as a healthcare provider. Now let's just review what we've talked about in this lecture. So competency refers to a threshold of understanding that one must have to be able to make autonomous decisions for themselves. Competence and incompetence is often contextual and dynamic, which is to say that in certain circumstances, maybe I'm considered competent, in other circumstances, I'm incompetent, and that competence can also change over time. I can be competent at one point and lose my competency, or I can be incompetent and gain competency. So it's important to realize that there is sort of an assessment that has to be done periodically, or it can't just be a one and done situation, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. There are many different standards of competence, and so how do we ultimately test for them is not straightforward because the evaluative means are biased in some way. There is obviously general accepted standards and practices in the healthcare field, but it's still good to always be critical about what is your test? Why did you choose these different abilities? Are they going to be misleading? Are they actually going to reveal that the patient's competent or incompetent enough to make decisions for themselves, especially if the decision might be as consequential or inconsequential, right? If a decision is life, or at least somebody's life is on the line, maybe the threshold for competence is higher. If it's a decision about what they're going to eat for lunch, maybe that competency can be lowered, or our expectations can be a lot lower. That's just to say that there's a lot going into what we're testing for and what we are what are the implications of competency or incompetency declaration there. Finally, there's a measure of gatekeeping that is necessary to ensure patients' health outcomes, but it's equally important to recognize how gatekeeping complicates the principle of respect for autonomy.